So number 41 is being aware of biases. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a lot of these ideas from this wonderful book written or published back in 2012, The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. He has over 100 different biases and logical fallacies and filters on our perception. And by being aware of these biases and the possible impact on our taking decisions, the idea is that we can actually start to limit the negative impact of those biases and try to see the world a little bit more clearly. An essential skill for all leaders. I've taken 6 sample biases from the book that we're going to look at here, and we're going to look at them in a little bit more detail to see how they might impact on our decisions and also maybe how we can deal with them. So let's start with the first one, confirmation bias. And this is where we look for information to support an opinion that we already have, or a decision we've already taken, or an idea that we've already formed. Now, the most famous case here that was used when people were researching this originally was that with people that were involved in the research, they gave them speeches that were theoretically written and given by a politician from a party that they did not, a political party they did not support. And then when they were asked their opinion, immediately the people who were part of the research experiment started to criticize the speech and say that they didn't agree with it. Then the researchers said, oh, I'm sorry, we've made a mistake. It's actually from another politician, a politician from a political party that the people in the experiment did support. And immediately the people who were part of the experiment started to say, well, actually, maybe they do have a point, and started to look for things in the speech that supported them. So this is a very common tendency, that we don't actually see the world as it is, but we see it in a way that supports decisions that we've already taken, or supports our worldview as we already have it. When it comes to marketing, actually, one of the things that people try to do is they try to identify values that people already have and then align the product and the service that they're trying to promote with those values. Because if people feel aligned with a company and feel aligned with a brand, there's a much greater chance that they will actually then stay loyal to that product or service. Now, when it comes to you being a leader of a group of people, you need to be very careful about forming an opinion about somebody and then maintaining that opinion afterwards, especially if it's quite a negative. It can also be a positive, but if it's a negative one, because maybe you saw them on a bad day. And as a result of seeing them on that bad day, afterwards, the danger is that you continue to see everything they do through a negative light. And the reality is that it's just because you are suffering from confirmation bias. So sometimes as well, when you are receiving information, it's a good idea to remove the person or the party or the company that is speaking from that message, and then think about, actually, how does this information look at when I eliminate who is the person who's presenting it? So I'm not just taking a decision based on an idea I already have about the presenter or speaker. In this particular case, also, it can help to be, devil's advocate to your own idea, or find somebody who can, somebody who's able to actually come along and argue and say, well, maybe there's another way of looking at this. Maybe you haven't thought about it from this perspective. And instead of being annoyed at that person, even though maybe they are actually wrong a lot of the time, but the times that they're not, it's extremely useful. The times that they're actually able to point out that you are suffering from this confirmation bias. So if you're not able to be a devil's advocate yourself, by simply asking yourself the question, okay, now imagine I don't have this right, or imagine there's another possible reason or way of looking at this same information. If you're not able to do that yourself, and it can be very difficult, well, then maybe you can actually, ask somebody to be a devil's advocate. Or today in 2024, it's also possible to ask, and presumably going forward as well, if you're watching this video in future, to maybe to create an artificial intelligence chatbot that can be that devil's advocate for you. The next bias we're looking at is groupthink, and this is by a guy called Irving Janis, who originally focused on this tendency for people to look at the harmony of the group as being more important than actually being truthful or identifying errors in the judgment of what the group has decided. So what happens is that there might be a minority or contentious views, but the group itself actually says, no, we don't even see those, where they're actually going to conform to the main idea of the group. And then everybody feels fantastic inside in the group because they've created this harmony, everybody is aligned. The problem, of course, is that maybe you have a toxic internal culture because people are only expressing external harmony and they're only trying to agree to not stand out. But the reality is that people actually don't feel comfortable with that, that group thing that's been created. Sometimes what also happens is that nobody criticizes obvious problems with a product or a service that's going to be launched to the general market. And then when there are critics, the critics are consumers or the critics are specialists outside the organization that destroy the product launch. So you can use techniques like an earlier video which we did on bonus 6 hats, or you could use structured thought process like red teaming. You can find a lot of information out there at the moment on red teaming to be a little bit critical about the decisions taken by a large group. Red teaming originally developed in the military, but you can now find it in, not only in software companies, but in many other companies as well. So I would suggest, in terms of dealing with groupthink, structured ways of organizing your meeting, like bonus 6 hats, or something like red teaming. The Dunning-Kruger effect, is a cognitive bias where people who have a low ability at something or a low knowledge, they actually overestimate their competence, while those with a high ability or high knowledge actually underestimate their knowledge of skills or skills. So sometimes what happens is that you find that people who have studied a subject very little, they don't even realize what they don't know. And then as they start to study more and they start to investigate more, they realize, wow, this field is much bigger than I had initially anticipated or realized, and they start to doubt all of their knowledge. So surprisingly, there's actually there's an upward curve when it comes to their knowledge and skills, but there's a downward curve when it actually comes to their confidence in that. So very simple things like, how does a toilet actually work? Many people think that because they're using a toilet on a daily basis, they know how it works. But when you ask them to explain it, they're not so sure. Very simple ideas like, how a bicycle works. You ask people to draw a bicycle, and very often they're not able to do this either. So in this case, it can be quite dangerous when you're dealing with organizations. For example, people normally feel more comfortable, and they've done tests on this to see actually how people react. Doctors who look very confident and they'll give you a prescription, they won't second guess themselves, they won't check it on the computer, and then people walk away thinking, yeah, that's a really good doctor, they look so confident. But when the doctor actually says, wait a moment, before I give you the prescription, I just want to make sure that we're identifying this right. They go into their computer, they double check it, and they say, yeah, that's fine. People trust those doctors less, when the reality is we should trust them more because they've double checked the answer that they're giving. But what happens is that in society, and depending on the culture, it could be even, the effect can be even more pronounced. People will trust apparent confidence over actual ability a lot of the time. And we need to be very careful of this, that we may be promoting, or we may be more impressed by people who are coming across as confident, when the reality is that there's no real evidence that they do know what they're actually doing. The framing effect, well, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this framing effect and I'm going to stretch it into a few other biases as well. But this is where the what that is being presented is actually heavily, our perception of that what is heavily influenced by how it is presented. And, the simple idea of the frame, it can be easy to understand because depending on the frame that you put on a painting, this can actually change your perception of the colors in the painting. So darker frames can bring out brighter colors in contrast, and the opposite can also happen. So as a result, what this idea of framing is, we try to think that if we're presenting information with one dark frame or one light frame, that actually influences how we perceive the painting. It influences how we perceive the email that's been sent. It changes how we perceive information that's been said to us. And a few examples of this, and again, we're stretching the framing effect into other biases, is simply the fact that depending on when the information is presented to us, if it's presented to us on a Friday before we may be having a long weekend, maybe we're impatient to go, so therefore we're not actually perceiving it in a positive light, because we're saying, listen, yeah, no, I'm not even going to take a decision on that. Because if you did start to think about it properly, you're going to have to work on Saturday. So maybe the timing wouldn't be right. The halo effect is going back, originally kind of explored by a guy called Thorndike at the beginning of the 20th century, is that people who are attractive or beautiful are also perceived as more trustworthy. They're perceived as more intelligent, and they're perceived as more confident. So the reality is that all they have in their favor is the fact that they're considered attractive by society, or beautiful or handsome by society. But then this creates a halo effect which influences people's perception of everything about them. So again, sometimes, and this is why it's also in many countries, they ask you not to include a photo when you're sending in your CV, so it doesn't influence people's decisions. The word order is also a way of framing. So if we put important words in a sentence when we're describing a product, words like tasty, if we're talking about food, for example, tasty, spicy, and bitter, the fact that tasty is at the beginning influences how we perceive the other things, the other words. But if we start with bitter, spicy, and tasty, that bitter actually influences the way we perceive the rest of the words. So we need to be careful of the word order there as well. Sometimes if we present things as a choice when the reality is there is no choice, people then feel it's framed, and therefore they perceive it in a different way. So if you're speaking to a small child, you don't say put on your shoes, because if you're saying putting on your shoes, the choice is shoes or no shoes. You frame it as a choice. You say, will you put on your blue shoes or your red shoes? They think that they're taking a choice, but the reality is they're putting on shoes at the end of the day. So very often when you present it as a choice, you're framing it as a choice, but the reality is there's no choice. Who is presenting it can have a very large impact as well. And this is again, I'm referring back to the confirmation bias. That sometimes when you eliminate the company or the person from the information you're receiving, and then look at it independently of that, you say, do I still like it, or maybe do I still dislike it? And finally, then priming. Priming is simply the idea that before you even have to take a decision, or sometimes even before you enter a room, they have primed you to feel or think in a certain way. Maybe they've been telling you jokes before you enter the room, or before we start talking about the sales. And as a result of that positive emotion, we then perceive the next situation in a different way. Sometimes we could be primed by entering a room that's, has a lot of reds, which makes us take more decisions more impulsively. So priming is that you're already thinking and prepared to feel in a certain way, so that when you then receive information, you're not actually receiving it in a rational way. You're receiving it through the filter that has already been prepared. Now, sometimes this priming can happen by accident, that just happen to be walking into a place with a friend of yours just before you went in to take an important decision. And as a result, that friend is making you laugh, but that could be an accident. But it could also be that they have designed the room in a certain way to make you feel certain ways, to fade away, that would be positive towards it, maybe with blues or greens, or possibly you're doing it in purple, which again, purple, it can be a lovely color, but if you're painting a room in it, it doesn't necessarily provoke positive thoughts in people when they enter a room that's been painted in purple. So the next one then is survivorship bias. This is where we judge an event or a situation incorrectly based on the fact that it is the only one that has actually survived. And I'm going to give some examples to help you understand this. Students at the end of a class who, you say, does anybody have any questions? And people say no. But the reality is that there may simply be the students who've survived to the end of the class. And that the reality is a lot of students have a lot of questions, but they just don't come to class anymore. So you're judging the fact that, everybody seems to understand everything. No, the people who've survived to the end of the class understand everything. Sometimes, and I know a few people who've done this with me, that old people who say, oh, young people today are very weak. And then you actually you realize that they're from a country or a time that the weak people in their society, they had terrible infant mortality, or people who just didn't survive to their teenage years. And as a result, of course, the only people who were surviving to their 90s are obviously the stronger people. They're not remembering the weaker people physically and with worse immune systems that would have died along the way. Now, thanks to fantastic medical care and more supportive organizations, many people who have, illnesses that would have been fatal in the past, or they have terrible allergies, or they have weaker immune systems, they are surviving, thankfully, to be criticized maybe by older people. And then the last one then here is that you might say, oh, yeah, everybody in this company is happy working late, so I don't know why you're not happy. But the reality is that the only people who are happy in the company and that are working late are the people who survive in the company, because anybody else who had a problem with it has left. So you also need to check and see, is there a high staff turnover in that organization? The story bias, very, very simple. The story bias, and I'm going to use one specific example, is that people for a long time believed that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. And it was discovered many years ago that it was actually it was a bacteria. It was in the stomach that was eating away at the lining of the stomach, and this is what was causing the stomach ulcer. Didn't matter how much evidence that the person who discovered this showed, people still preferred the good story that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. He even had to drink the bacteria, get a stomach ulcer, and then fix it with antibiotics, to try and prove his point. And people still hold on to the good story. We as humans have a tendency to prefer good stories over uh, over the facts very often. So I could say about my own wonderful country, oh yes, 80%, and this is obviously not true, but 80% of people who go to Ireland have a terrible time. And it's the opposite, of course, is everybody has a fantastic time going to Ireland. But imagine I said that 80% of people who go to Ireland have a terrible time, and then somebody else would come along and say, no, no, my friend was in Ireland last week and he had a great time. And we say, oh, okay, then maybe that's true. So what happens is you end up believing who has a story about their friend over the fact that there are statistics out there which say 80% did not have a good time. Now, the reality here is that maybe the friend that you're talking about was one of the 20%. But what it is that we get hung up so much on stories, and politicians all around the world know this better than anybody. They're telling us stories rather than facts, and the facts are very often twisted into stories and narratives. Again, thinking of confirmation bias, stories and narratives that reflect what we already believe. Okay, so these are 6 sample biases that should help you start thinking about the fact that as a leader, you need to be very, very careful of automatically thinking that you have a correct vision of reality, a correct perception of reality, and maybe you need to start building in structures into your decision making process to check and see if you've actually got things right or not. Okay, so that is number 41, being aware of biases.